All right, in today's video, I'm going to go over creating a successful landscape. How to create a successful landscape. So what you're going to do is with the oil pastel techniques learned, you're going to apply those techniques to a beautiful landscape of your choice. So after I go through this presentation, you will have time to look for a reference picture, something that you will use to look closely at to create your landscapes using oil pastels. So the first thing I want us to look at, and I know that this was discussed earlier, was the idea of foreground, middle ground, and background. So in this picture, you have your foreground, which is the front of the picture. You have your middle ground, which is the middle, and then the background, which is everything that is behind the foreground and middle ground, the way back of the picture. When you create a landscape, one other thing you need to really pay attention to is the idea of perspective, or the idea of atmospheric perspective. And I'll get into that a little bit with you in the next slide. But when you look at this picture, I want you to think, what do you see? What changes are occurring from the foreground to the middle ground to the background? If you look at the mountain tops in the foreground, what do you see? Is it the same as what you see in the middle ground and the background? Or does the foreground, the front of the picture, look much different from the middle ground image or the middle of your picture? And does the middle of that picture, the mountaintops, look different from the way background, right? So when you're creating art and you're looking at things, you want to really look closely at what's happening, details that are occurring throughout that image. So right now we're going to look at atmospheric perspective. I'm just going to turn this off for a second and pull this up on my website. So what is atmospheric perspective? Atmospheric perspective, also called aerial perspective, is the effect that you get when faraway objects take on the color of atmospheric haze. So if you look at this picture, like the one that's on my presentation, the foreground looks much different from the middle ground and different from the background. Okay. And the reason that's occurring where it's like a lot darker and maybe even more vibrant, or you can see more detail in the foreground, is because that's closer to us. And the further that you get, the less detail you're seeing, the cooler the color comes, the lighter in value that object becomes. So here are just important things to know about atmospheric perspective. The saturation decreases. Saturation is the intensity, the vibrancy of the color. So in this image, you can see that the intensity of the foreground is there. There's detail, the colors are bright. Where if you look all the way to the background, you're losing all of that. It's becoming very cool in color. It's almost blue. In every picture, you'll notice it becomes like a cool blue, right? Contrast decreases. Contrast would be how light or dark something is. So in the foreground of the picture, it has that, again, that intensity of color and contrast. You'll see a lot of light and darks, where the further you get, the less you will see of that contrast. Brightness increases. So in the foreground of a picture, things will be much darker in value, where the further you get the further you get from the foreground, the lighter it will become. Edges remain even sharp even when far away. So I guess, you know, the when you're looking at the foreground of an image, it's going to be, again, clearer because you're seeing things closer. I mean, if you think about common sense, right? We look at something really close, we're seeing all the detail within that object. But the further we get from it, the less we're seeing. You can even see it at night. All right. It says atmospheric perspective appears in other media other than air, so you can actually see it underwater as well. Okay. Um, Atmospheric perspective intensifies when there's heavy fog and pollution. You might see that over in New York City. Might be weakened by strong lighting. All right. So this link to this site is actually on my presentation that I have here. So I'm going to just continue to play this. Okay. So this is the link we just looked at about atmospheric perspective. So we can see these things in the pictures that I'm showing you. In fact, I'm going to go back, right? We can see these things happening. And you could say, yeah, I get that, Ms. Daubel. But the challenge here is trying to create that in your picture, right? So now you need to take your oil pastels and understand how to apply that to your drawing and your oil pastel picture. That's our job as an artist, right? Is to create an image that looks believable. And in order to make it look more believable, you want to demonstrate these things like atmospheric perspective that we're seeing within these images. So when we draw, I feel like we have automatically we just want to make everything that's green the same color green, right? Everything that's blue the same color blue, but you really need to pay close attention to value. Value is how dark or light something is, and also variation, right? Not every tree has the same color green leaf. Things change, same with grass, with dirt. There's variety. Even the shape of each object in nature changes, right? So every leaf is not completely the same. So these are little details you need to look closely at. If you look at this image, the value, meaning the darkness or lightness of all of these greens that I'm using are the same. The green on the trees of the evergreens are exactly the same. The green on the grass is exactly the same. The green I have on the tree in the foreground is the same as the green in the background. This is a no-no. This makes your image look very flat and two-dimensional. When you're drawing, you want to make it look three-dimensional. So here's how I would apply atmospheric perspective. The picture to the left is showing what I just showed you here, right? The picture on the right is how I adjusted the color. So you can see I'm using the idea of atmospheric perspective. The pictures in the foreground are a lot darker. They're more intense. They're and more vibrant and rich in color. Where you can see in the middle ground, the water now changes, the value changes, and then the background, the value changes. Everything becomes lighter and less saturated. So now my eye is being pulled to the foreground and away from the background, creating this idea, this illusion of depth. All right. And I know that this was covered before with you, but the idea of foreground, middle ground, and background you want to pay close attention to. My foreground would include the green landscape in the front with actually all of the trees. The two evergreens are in the foreground, and so are those two big trees up against the right evergreen. The middle ground of my image is really the water, and the background is really the trees in the background, the landscape in the background, along with the sky. Knowing your foreground, middle ground, background will help you to figure out how to change the color and the value of each of those areas. All right, so for this project, you're going to be creating a landscape. You're learning oil pastels, which you've already learned, and we're trying to really understand the idea of atmospheric perspective. All right, so here are some examples of oil pastels using atmospheric perspective. You can see that the foreground and the middle ground of the picture are more intense in color. You can see that the foreground has a lot more detail in it. Once you start getting to your middle ground, it's losing that detail. And in the background, you'll notice that the colors become a lot cooler, meaning blue or purple, right? And that creates that illusion of depth. If you made that mountain green, it's going to look very flat and unrealistic. All right, this is a little bit blurry, but same idea. You have your foreground, your middle ground, and background. Your foreground and your middle ground are more intensified in color. Your foreground has more detail. You can see more lines and texture. Your middle ground starts to lose that, but then your background becomes really cool, right? You can see that we're now applying more purples and blues into that background. Here's another example. Same idea. Intense colors towards the foreground, more detail and those beautiful flowers in the front. And then once you get to your background, it becomes a lot cooler. And you could have a cool background with a sunset, right? You could have a beautiful sunset occurring over the sky with cool blue mountains. Okay. Another example. This picture looks really cold because of the colors that are being used, but the foreground pictures are more intense. I'm sorry, the foreground colors are more intense. The background colors are cooler. All right, and you're seeing this repeat all the way through my images here, right? So you're going to create a landscape. Now, I'm showing you a lot of mountainous landscapes. It doesn't really have to be. I would like to see a nature landscape, but you could have more trees if you wanted to. You don't have to necessarily have water. What I want you to do today is look for landscapes. All right, look for images that you might use as reference. It's important to have a reference picture of what you're going to draw. It's important to see something in front. Not that it will look exactly like that. It might or it may not, but it's important to have that picture in front of you to use as reference. So what you could look up is you could look up landscapes. All right. I don't want to see you look up oil pastel landscapes. I want to see you look up landscapes that are photographs. So if I typed in landscapes, these are all different types of landscapes that are coming up. So if there's one that interests you, I want you to save it to your computer. In fact, I want you to find 2 or 3 images that you would be interested in using as reference for drawing your landscape. You could also look up atmospheric landscapes, right? And you'll find a little bit more of what I was talking about, or extreme versions of atmospheric perspective, what I was going over with you, right? You do not have to use a picture from the internet. You can use your own picture. So if you were somewhere on vacation and you took beautiful pictures that you're now realizing, oh wow, that demonstrates atmospheric perspective, you should use your own picture. But I will let you look also online. So what I'd like you to do is under the assignment, which I'm going to create, oil pastels, reference pictures, you are going to attach 2 to 3 images that you were reference photos that you were thinking about using as reference for this project. All right, if you have any questions, let me